There's a book that's getting a lot of attention since everyone's caught up in the World Cup. It's called Red Card, How the U.S. Blew the Whistle on the World's Biggest Sports Scandal. Ken Bensinger joins us. Good morning, Ken.
Good morning.
So let's go to the beginning. For those of us who don't follow soccer and FIFA very closely, there was a whole lot of shenanigans going on with this bid for Russia and this bid for Qatar, right? That's the argument?
Well, it's one of the arguments. The more basic argument is that the sport of soccer, which, as you said, many of us here in the States don't follow that much, is tremendously huge and popular in the rest of the world. To a scale it's kind of hard to fathom when you're not out there. But it's so big and it involves so much money that it has become incredibly corrupt over the decades. And one of the things that's come up is that there's the kind of shenanigans you're talking about related to where the World Cup will be held, because the World Cup is the most important event in that sport. I mean, you think about the World Cup, it's like a month-long Super Bowl. It gets, all those games get more attention than almost any sporting game in the U.S. ever. And countries that want to host it are willing apparently to do almost anything. And Russia was really eager to host the World Cup back in 2010 when that was up for bid, as was Qatar to host the 2022 World Cup. And it turns out the central argument of what my book is about is that the U.S. opened a criminal investigation as a result of what were perceived to be untoward or inappropriate activities by Russia to try to get the World Cup, which they ultimately succeeded in doing.
I mean, we've seen and lived through the Olympic scandal. How much worse is this FIFA scandal with the World Cup than what we saw with the Olympic scandal?
Yeah, Olympic scandal is a great example, and actually one that prosecutors in the case that I wrote about paid a lot of attention to. That case was pretty bad in that it was very blatant, the amount of bribery going on to get people, the IOC members, to vote to give it to Salt Lake City. That's one scandal, and then, of course, there's the other big scandal, which you may have been referring to, which was the Russia doping scandal. This is much bigger because this is not just one discrete thing. There was corruption in terms of the voting for what country would host it, but there's also, it turns out, corruption at almost every other level. Every TV contract, almost every TV contract, every sponsorship deal, what uniforms different national teams were wearing, what players would end up coming on the field for certain matches. It turns out, and this is what the U.S. DOJ, the FBI, and the IRS uncovered, almost every one of those deals, it turns out, there was a bribe. Somebody was getting a bribe or a kickback on almost every one of the deals dating back at least to the late 1980s, even to the 90s, tune of hundreds of millions of dollars every few years. It's sort of, really untold amounts of money corrupting every aspect of the sport.
Ken Bensinger, the book is called Red Card. It's shocking that isn't a bigger story here in the U.S. Where are they in this investigation? Is it finished? Have they concluded it? Where are they in all of this?
Well, I will say it was briefly quite a big story in the U.S. and everywhere else. You may recall back in 2015, in May 2015, there were some arrests in Zurich, Switzerland. Plainclothes Swiss police arrested a bunch of soccer officials from FIFA, the organization that runs soccer and organizes the World Cup. These people raided this hotel and were arrested, and it made front-page news everywhere around the world, including the States. It was a different kind of news environment then, but that was a front-page story for days and days and days, and it was a big deal. And that was the public culmination of this investigation, or at least the public coming out of this investigation, which had been run in secret for years. And it was all anyone could talk about for a few days. But the investigation continued. That was the first round of indictments. There was a second round of indictments 6 months later, and it continues. Every once in a while, someone else will plead guilty in the case. There was a big trial of the case last November and December in New York, where the prosecutors are based, and they convicted two soccer officials, one from Brazil and one from Paraguay. And those people are awaiting sentencing, and there's about 24 other people who have also been convicted in the case, and several companies as well. So the investigation continues, and other countries have followed suit. France, Germany, Switzerland, Spain, Australia, a bunch of countries have opened their own criminal investigations as sort of copycat investigations of what the U.S. did.
The book is called Red Card, How the U.S. Blew the Whistle on the World's Biggest Sports Scandal. Ken Bensinger, our guest. Is it true that, am I reading this right, that they called in Donald Trump to help figure out how they rigged the bids?
I don't recall them calling in Donald Trump. They called in. What they did do was when the investigation was going on for about a year, they ended up flipping a guy named Chuck Blazer, who was a friend of Donald Trump's and who lived in the Trump Tower. This guy, Chuck Blazer, the most powerful American soccer official in history, and he had come from youth soccer, where he was like a suburban soccer dad outside of New York City. He had risen up the ranks to become one of the 24 most powerful men in all of world soccer. And in November 2011, IRS and the FBI flipped him and made him a secret cooperator in the case. And they did that because he was enormously corrupt, had personally stolen upwards of $20 million from the sport, and had also not reported to the IRS. He hadn't paid taxes in 17 years. So they were able to convince him that it was in his personal interest to help the case. And he explained how it all worked. And he was, as I mentioned earlier, someone who lived in the Trump Tower, had a personal relationship with Donald Trump. And it's one of many Trump connections in this case, which makes it all the more interesting and intriguing. In fact, the entire case was opened as a result of a tip from none other than Christopher Steele, who, of course, has become quite famous in the last couple of years. But at the time, no one had ever heard of Steele. And Steele told an FBI agent that Russia was up to no good with its bid for the World Cup. That agent, who was a specialist in Russian crime and Russian money laundering, came back to New York with this tip, opened the case, and it went from there. And the relationship that this FBI agent built with Christopher Steele meant that when Steele years later had the famous Trump dossier that he had written or had compiled, he called up the same FBI agent and gave it to him. And the only reason the FBI agent took it seriously is because the credibility that he had, that Christopher Steele had developed because of the soccer case.
Ken Bensinger, our guest. The book is called Red Card, How the U.S. Blew the Whistle on the World's Biggest Sports Scandal. They just announced and just voted that the U.S., along with Canada and Mexico, are going to host the next World Cup. Did they fix these problems, or what do you think about that bid?
It's a good question. You know, the U.S., Canada, and Mexico had a combined bid called the United Bid, and that bid was up against Morocco. And Morocco is a country that had tried to get the World Cup several times before and never failed, but it was also on paper very evident that Morocco was totally ill-equipped to host an event like this. The World Cup is big as it is. By the time 2026 rolls around, it's going to be even bigger, 50% bigger. They're going to add 16 more teams and make it a 48-team World Cup, and the infrastructure required is enormous. To give you a sense, the economy of Morocco and their ability to host something like this, Morocco's GDP as a nation is almost identical to that of Missouri, the state of Missouri. So, Morocco is proposing building 9 new stadiums and reconditioning 5 more to host the World Cup. Sort of imagine, 15 new stadiums in the state of Missouri.
Right.
It's a massive undertaking, and it seemed pretty clear they couldn't do it. The fact that FIFA didn't award it to Morocco, but instead awarded it to the United Bid, I think is a positive move. I think it suggests that there's some kind of sanity in the organization, because when they awarded it to Qatar, essentially it was clear, and to some extent Russia as well, it was pretty clear that sanity was not in the room and this was simply a money grab. So the fact that the U.S., Canada, and Mexico got it suggests that FIFA is beginning to try to clean things up. That said, I wouldn't believe that it's better yet. It's a long way to go. There's still pretty wanton acts of corruption happening on a very regular basis in the sport. Just a few weeks ago, the Soccer Federation of the African country Ghana was completely dissolved because a video documentary report came out showing officials from that federation taking cash bribes. There was images of the president of the Ghanaian Soccer Association taking, I think, $60,000 in cash that were put in his hand. So you get a sense that it's still, we might be walking in the right direction, but we're not out of the woods yet.
The book is called Red Card. Ken Bensinger, quick last question for you. Any evidence of any on-the-field shenanigans and or problems with the on-the-field refs calls or anything like that?
There's a long history of questions of match fixing in soccer, and I think it's a real thing. But I also think it's fairly separate from the investigation that the American law enforcement undertook. In fact, they made a conscious decision that this wasn't a match fixing investigation. The reason for it is because the soccer officials who benefited from all these bribes, all these under the table payments for the rights to the games, to the sponsorship, to where the tournament's going to be hosted, to the uniforms, etc., didn't want there to be match fixing because they thought it would damage the image to the game. Now, it sounds kind of laughable because clearly the bribery they were engaged in also damaged the image to the game. But their idea was that match fixing could undermine the credibility of the game and make people not want to watch it, and that would kill the golden goose. So what becomes pretty clear is that the people involved in fixing matches is a very different batch of people than those involved in other kinds of soccer bribery. And it seems more likely that the match fixing stuff is done by organized crime syndicates, mostly running out of Asia, out of Singapore and Hong Kong, places like that, where sports betting is a big deal. It's also clear that most on-field shenanigans tend to happen at the lower levels of sport, simply because if you think about the teams playing in the World Cup, or you think about teams playing at the highest professional level of the sport, these people are paid incredibly well. These players make millions of dollars, just almost as much or more as American pro athletes. And it would cost a huge amount of money to bribe one of these players or to bribe one of the refs to get them to fix a match. But if you fix a lower division obscure match in Guatemala or something, it's quite cheap to bribe a referee, and you can still make money betting on that match. So the worst problems tend to be at the middle, the lower levels of the game professionally.
Getting a lot of attention, Ken Bensinger's new book called Red Card, How the U.S. Blew the Whistle on the World's Biggest Sports Scandal. Simon & Schuster. It is out now, getting a lot of attention. Ken, good luck with the book. Thanks for stopping by.
My